believes that what the Shephelah is, in terms of culture and religion, is the connecting point between Judah's hill country, which is isolated, and the rest of the world, which is out there. You know, I know we can't see terribly far, but out there on the coastal plain. And so the Shephelah becomes the point of interactivity between the ideas that God reveals to Judea's hill country and the rest of the world. And what I find so striking is all of the stories that we have, the primary stories that are Judean Shephelah stories, are stories that are about experimenting with how you might take the ideas of that place and bring them into this place. All nations of the earth will be blessed through you, Genesis 12:3. So we know the idea pool that's gathering up here around the temple and around Judah's hill country where the foundation stories is not supposed to stay isolated there, but is to get into the world. So we begin to look at some of these stories and saying, what happens through this Shephelah? How does that connection look? And I'll just overview the story set that I see here, because you'll see that there's more than one approach. We have stories of Samson. I'll overview those for you, related to this place. Those are stories of normalization. Samson, 3 different times in the storyline, tries to normalize relationships with the Philistines out here through marriage. Secondly, we see in this valley system the Ark of the Covenant coming back in. And that reminds us of that larger story we started to speak of yesterday at Shiloh, 1 Samuel 4, 5, and 6, where the Israelites begin to assimilate into the pagan worldview of their neighbors, and now they're using the Ark of the Covenant like a talisman. We'll talk about the Elah Valley story of David and Goliath. Clearly a story within its own frame that's designed to show us that David is superior to Saul. We'll emphasize that when we tell the story. But when we back it out and we put it in conjunction with these other Shephelah stories, we see a combat story that becomes another way in which the hill country is interacting with the coastal plain, and it really isn't end in a very positive result for the kingdom or church. So we have 3 Old Testament stories that run down here. We have a story of normalization, a story of assimilation, and a story of combat, and at no point do we feel like we've really arrived at how the hill country and the coastal plain should operate. I never brought those stories together in that group until I realized there's one more Shephelah story out of the New Testament, and that's the story of Philip and the Ethiopian. And that's the story where we have Philip coming out of the hill country, making contact with someone from Africa, and finally we have a Shephelah story that shows how Genesis 12:3 should be enacted as God's people in the central hill country bring the world into a clearer understanding of the revelation that they've received. So by way of overview, we're looking at stories where we have Judah's hill country connected physically to the world through the Shephelah. These stories then look like experiments in how that interaction might best look. Is it best if we just normalize? Is it best if we assimilate? Is it best if we fight? Is it best if we evangelize? And obviously you can see a trajectory there that I'm following. I think we're moving towards a much more satisfying answer to the question, how should the hill country ideas meet the world? And it's through the last of those 4 Shephelah stories. So that's broad overview. Before I move into a more specific Bible event related here, is there something you'd like to clarify about about the Shephelah, architecture, geology, human geography, or about this idea of what sort of storylines run here in the Shephelah?